Thank you for joining and welcome to our webinar on gamification in the lab versus the field, hosted by Busara. So I'm Zina Oberoi. I'm an associate at Busara and I'll be your moderator today, assisted by Pauline. So we have a fantastic program lined up today where we'll be exploring the world of gamification, examining its applications in both controlled lab environments and real-world settings. Our panelists bring a lot of experience and a lot of insights that will shed light on this topic. So just to give you a little bit of a background on why we decided to host this webinar at this point in time, it's a follow-up to our recently published groundwork titled Using Gamification to Enhance Development, How Game Elements Can Contribute to Sustainable Development in the Global South. And this report highlights the potential of gamification in fostering sustainable development. And today's discussion really aims to unpack these ideas and delve deeper into the subject. So the aim of today's session is firstly to discuss various ways we use lab games and game mechanisms in our work, and provide insights to development practitioners on how gamification can be incorporated into their work. So now to kick things off, I'd first like to share a poll on gamification experiences. So you can all let us know your experience with gamification, or if you don't have any. And then I'd like our panelists to take a couple of minutes to introduce themselves. Jennifer, would you like to start?
Thank you, Zina. So my name is Jennifer Adhiambo, and I'm a Senior Research Manager at BRES. So BRES stands for Bureau's Research and Academic Engagements. Yeah, so my role here at Busara, mainly I manage a portfolio of projects where I work directly with researchers, both local and international. Yes, thanks so much for
joining. Sorry, I'll go next. Hello, everyone. My name is Murtaza. I'm an associate at Busara as well in the risk mitigation portfolio. And a lot of the projects we've been working on are just basically using gamification in improving farmer and agent experiences. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Julia Hamann. I'm also part of the research and advisory team at Busara, working as a senior associate.
Yeah. So hi everyone, and my name is Pauline Wanjeri, and I'm a research coordinator. I also work in the BRACE team, and I've worked a lot on part of implementing of lab games, and I look forward to this experience. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'd like to hand it over to Pauline for some housekeeping rules before we start our discussion.
Hello, I'm definitely not Pauline. My name is Michael Onsando. I'm just jumping in here because Pauline's video isn't working. But I am capable of doing housekeeping. Thank you and welcome to this webinar. So we're going to use the chat for general comments and feedback. You can post to everyone or to the panelists only. If you have any question at any point, please fill it in the Q&A tab. We'll answer some of the questions on a rolling basis, and most of the questions we'll answer the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Of course, depending on how many questions we have and time availability. If you'd like to chip in and say something, please raise your hand. Although we might not always be able to let you chip in. That will be at the moderator's discretion. And of course, we're going to run polls throughout the session, so feel free to engage with us by filling them out. Thank you so much, and hope you enjoy your webinar.
Thanks, Michael, for taking that up. So I guess we can now dive into our discussion. So essentially, we're talking about gamification, and gamification can be understood as using game designs in different contexts. And this can be in various settings, whether it's in the controlled lab environment or in a real-world setting. So I think the first thing that would be really interesting to understand from our panelists is What is gamification in a lab setting versus a real world setting, and how do these gamification mechanisms differ or are the same across the two?
Yeah, so maybe I can start by contributing to that question. So it's, as you mentioned, it's important for us to understand, lab games and lab settings. And as you mentioned, Zina already, for the lab games, we tend to conduct lab games in a lab setting, which is a controlled environment. And we're talking about controlled environment, it's an environment that is created that is free from distractions. And also, when you're using lab games, you're in a way trying to understand human behavior and also how people make different decisions. Yeah, so the lab environment sort of provides us with this control environment that we're able to, test these different mechanisms. So here at Busara, we use different kind of lab setups to be able to do this. So first and foremost, we have what you call a stationary lab. And this lab is mainly located here in Nairobi. So in the lab provides, as we talk about, like being able to provide this kind of controlled environment. So how the lab setup is just as a network of computers, and these computers are also sort of like set up within private cubicles. And the reason why also we are having private cubicles, it allows us for participants who like to make their decisions privately without interference, and also just to ensure they get their safety and privacy guaranteed when they're making decisions. Also just trying to overcome certain challenges with our stationary lab. Because in the time, for the lab, we normally invite our participants to come in and participate in our various studies. And being able to run from a stationary lab stuff limits how far, in terms of geographically, how far we are able, to conduct and implement our lab studies in a lab setting. Because as we've already talked about, this kind of environment that we're trying to create, because in a way, in a lab setting, we are mimicking a certain, behavior in a real world setup. So for us, we like to create this environment outside our stationary lab. We also use a different kind of setup that we call the lab in the field setup. Yeah, so for the lab in the field setup, still, we are still trying to maintain the same conditions, but when it comes to the lab in the field setup, more like trying to get this more like a real type of environment, but still trying to maintain, the mechanisms that we have in our stationary lab. And also another type of setup that Sarah has used in our studies, and just to play and run some of these lab games, we have what we call a mobile lab. And I would say, interestingly, a mobile lab is a concept that really came in handy for a study that we are trying to run with a population that were affected by maybe certain cultural factors. So sometimes, it limits for them to be able to travel outside a given neighborhood. So for the kind of mobile labs, we were able to build a lab within a bus. So for this, still trying to imitate the kind of setup that we have within our physical lab here in Nairobi, we create the same environment. We like to travel to these locations to reach vulnerable or hard to reach population. So yeah, basically that's also just paint a picture into the different kind of lab settings that we have here, Sarah, and how that enables us, to play the different lab games. And when you're talking about lab games, and as we all understand, games sometimes can have this interesting, angles that people while playing, they're accompanied by certain rules, certain objectives that you want to achieve within that particular, when you're using certain games. So in a lab setup, also when we're trying to play these games, it allows us to vary certain variables, and when varying those variables, we're able to measure certain aspects of the human decision making process. And some of those are thinking about how people make decisions and how we want to understand human behavior. And I've talked about using these games. So for example, if you want to measure something like trust, so we have different types of games that have been designed that it helps us to be able to measure trust. And a common example that we use here in Busara, we call it the trust game. So the trust game sort of allows us to measure the level of trust and reciprocity, and thinking about how people relate, or how people think about maybe the social aspects within a community or society. So you're able to measure also these kind of relationships within a lab setting. And also think about something being able to work, if you want to measure something like cooperation. So you also use a common game that's called now the public goods game, that sort of measures how much people are willing to contribute to a given public. Yeah, so Just in summary, just being like a side, like, this is a lab. So, it's something that I think is a very useful tool here in Busara that allows us and gives us the flexibility. And also within a lab setup, you're able to achieve certain mechanisms like, getting some randomness, because sometimes, in other setups, you're not able like to achieve through random samples. And also in a lab environment also allows us to sort of like test and also replicate certain studies from one context to the other. Yeah, maybe I'll let someone else also contribute, like when it comes to like different environments, versus like, for example, using lab settings, and also how that differs in a real world setup.
Yeah, to complement Jennifer, because Jennifer and I have actually worked on a project together where we have implemented a lab game to understand farmers' decision-making in the context of risk-taking and weather information. And there it was a very defining experience for us because we used a lab game to measure risk. It's a balloon game where farmers blow up a balloon, and then eventually they collect points if the balloon bursts. They lose the points again. And if the balloon stays active and stays very round and big, they get and collect a lot of points. However, since the farmers have not really used balloons in birthday parties or in any normal settings, we found that the risk-taking of the farmers was actually a lot higher than it is in the real setting, because they found it funny when the balloon burst, and they didn't understand that that's a risk that the balloon would burst, because in their childhood, maybe they didn't play with balloons sufficiently. So that was an interesting experience for us to also change the risk-taking games and mitigation in a context where it makes sense. And we have implemented a second risk measure as part of the lab games, the mobile lab that Jennifer was talking about, where we have contextualized this game and actually asked them a question. Okay, would you rather use manure, which is a fertilizer that doesn't cost any money, or would you invest a little bit in fertilizer to make sure that your harvest, even though there is a drought or even though the conditions of the soil are not as great, would endure that, right? So there is a risk that this condition will happen. And if they use the fertilizer, they can reduce the risk. And that they understood. So they were willing then to invest a little bit of money, even though they didn't know the outcome of the fertilizer working or not working, to mitigate the risk in the decision making. And that was far more contextualized for them, and they understood it better than the BART game, it's called, as a psychological measure to measure risk-taking or risk-seeking behaviors in decision-making. So that was a very interesting study on how we could actually measure risk in real-life settings. And just to highlight here as well, if you talk about the real-life environment and the settings, games can not only be used as a powerful tool to measure decision-making or behavior, but it could also play a crucial role if you try to make a concept that's rather theoretical understandable, right? So here we were talking about gamifying weather information. And if you just give them weather information, the usual scientific standard way, they might not always, or the farmers might not always take this up in decision making, because what they're used to is to look at the sky, look at the way, yeah, I think look at their environment. I'm not a farmer myself, so I don't know exactly how they use the weather information, but it's when we did the pre-testing, it was sure that they used some sort of weather information that was non-scientific. So then when you were trying to gamify the weather information and use, for example, a local person announcing the weather forecast, right, over the radio, or inducing a little bit of emotional framing. So for example, if you don't pay attention to the weather forecast, your kids might not be able to go to school next year because you would lose out on the harvest, and kind of frame it in a loss frame instead of just framing it positively. Oh, you should look at the weather forecast, it's good for you. That also played a role, and you're able to test all those assumptions through a lab environment, but also you can use games as an intervention to increase the uptake of weather information of the farmers in decision making. Yeah, back over to you, Sina.
Thanks, Jennifer and Julia. I think it's really fascinating how you mentioned the importance of culture, of like contextually adapting the gamification like elements to wherever you're implementing them, and then also trying to see like what are the farmers' past experiences or the players' past experiences, and whether those can be leveraged as well. I just want to open up the floor now for the audience for one question, if anyone has a question right now, before we move on to the next point of discussion. Feel free to raise your hand if there's something that you'd like to ask. Okay. Digvijoy, I think you were the first one to raise your hand. So would you like to go ahead? Go ahead. Digvijoy Samadar?
I don't think they can speak.
Oh,
Yeah. Maybe they can put the question in the chat and you can read it. And there's already a question in the chat.
okay. Unfortunately, I'm unable to see the panelist chat. So Michael, if you could just help me out with that.
Yeah.
Please.
So we have a question here from, and we're going to answer some questions live. We're going to answer some questions later. But we have a question here from Talal Syed Ahmed, who asks, what does the typical mobile app setup consist of? I think that would go to Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I would say like in our case, how we define a mobile app. So it's more like trying to think about like, how you are able to, create a setup that enables you to travel from one location to the other. So for our case, for the study that we're talking about that we're able to conduct in India, that was like in Haryana, India, trying to understand the uptake, of AI pills amongst pregnant and lactating women. So for that study, also thinking about like this kind of population, it's a vulnerable population, also like due to cultural factors, they're not able to travel far, from their neighborhood to be able like to attend maybe a lab setup within a given location. So we had to sort of like, think of ways on which we were able to reach this population. And that's when the idea of the mobile lab was born. And this is basically a lab that's built within a bus. So trying to think about like, trying to create the same more like, an environment as we have in our other lab setups. So basically building in like the computers, and usually like the computers are usually a network, of computers that allows us, to collect data. Yeah, so that's what we refer by a mobile lab. I hope that clearly answers the question.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible now.
Sorry, I don't think there was an audio option then. So my question actually pertains to how does one go about contextualizing the lab games to specific global south contexts where which is very different from the Western labs where these games are originally made. So what are the steps which are actually taken to start contextualizing those games and to be able to measure the same things that one would in the lab?
Yeah, if I can also take that. Yeah, so I'll try to give an example of how maybe one process that really went through in trying to contextualize some of these games. And I think the main reason why we have to go through the process of contextualization is because most of these lab games or maybe some of these measures have been used in in the weird population context, that's like the Western educated, rich, industrialized. So being able to sort of like, think about how best do we ensure that these games are able to, sort of like, be able to use the same measures within in a different like setup and context. Yeah, so in the process of like contextualization, so we try to think about, try to give an example of one of the biases that we used during the process of contextualization, and so like try to translate that into the more like the Kenyan context. So thinking about a bias like, the attraction bias, so where they, sorry, yeah, where we are sort of like, using I would say like, using, for example, certain terms or features that do not really or might not relate within a given context. For example, thinking about and that, like, for example, we're using the magazine, which is The Economist, and so also like, talking about the different values that are presented there, as things that people, for example, in the Kenyan context might not easily relate with. And also most of our work we conduct them with the low income population, which also now again brings a different angle to able to really, translate some of these concepts. So for that, you have to sort of like go through a process where you have to like, trying to consider some of these features or factors. So you think about like, what would be really will compare for example, with we think about like the Economist magazine and subscriptions. So in the Kenyan context, we think about something like, data bundles and how much to pay for different packages, and also trying to change maybe the amounts from dollars to Kenya shillings so that can clearly, relate to the different amounts. And while we are testing, because also like, when you are contextualizing these versions, you have to, you are keeping the original, you're not losing some of the components of the original design. So it means, you have to stop collect data using the original version, the contextualized version, instead of like, make a comparison to ensure that, you are not losing any important components. Yeah, so I think contextualization like take like so many different, angles, and also like depending on the complexity of a given game. So that's like defined. For some games are very simple and straightforward, like the dictator game. You don't need to like really go through an intense process of contextualization. You just need to maybe think about updating the amounts, thinking about, for example, what are people's for example, living, for example, talk about like the income levels and adjusting some of those to reflect, people's actual income levels so that they're able to make decisions. Because also, in a lab setting, using the lab games, we try to reveal people's true preferences. And you're revealing, when you're measuring people's true preferences, you're supposed to use, because most of the games we try to incentivize them so that people can actually make decisions. So using deciding on the right incentive amount so that people are able to make like accurate, maybe reflect decisions that are reflective of the actual behavior. Yeah, so it's a very, intense process that also involves locals, because also like for us here, if we are conducting a study in Kenya, you have to ensure that you're involving the right people in the process of contextualization. Now, if anyone else within the team would like to add.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think we can move on to the next discussion point, and please, to everyone in the audience, feel free to write down your questions in the chat, and we'll try and answer them live or in the Q&A session or afterwards. So our next question focuses on the impact of gamification, namely, how can we measure the impact of game mechanics, especially on behavior change? So
I'll take that.
Okay.
Yeah, so when we talk about measuring the impact of gamification, like on behavior change, there are different ways that we can use to measure, but we have one that is very common, that is the pre and post intervention survey. So for the pre, you can do like a baseline survey where you get to understand the knowledge, the attitudes, the behavior. And after the intervention, now you can do like an end line, which is the post survey. And this will help you to check whether there was an impact or effect after the intervention. So that is the main approach. But something else that we can also use is like incorporating like tools, like tracking tools. Say if it's a study that is whose primary goal is like focusing on literacy, children's literacy, maybe using a particular tool, and also and emphasizing on parent-child engagement. So you can put in like tools that can help you track like how many times they logged into the app, like how many books did they read, and like did they complete like a book and all that. So this can help you track like the progress within different timelines, and this can also help you to like know exactly whether there was behavior change. Yeah, so maybe another thing that we can do is also like follow up. We can do like follow-up surveys, like after the intervention, you can do follow-up surveys. Yeah, so these are different ways that we can use to measure the impact of gamification. So maybe one thing that I need to mention is that gamification or the impact doesn't happen like within a very short time. So like you need to be patient, you need to keep on testing until you find that we have like there's a change. And how do you ensure like also like there's also like sustained engagements? So what you can do, giving an example of maybe this parent-child engagement that they are working towards improving literacy. So we can add things like nudges, we can add things like rewards, and these are going to like motivate to ensure that there's continued parent-child engagement to promote literacy. So maybe something else that we might also need to think about is also like adaptation. We all live in a dynamic world, and we should be very open to like changing the way we've designed like this intervention so that we can ensure that we are able to test and drive the change that we need into the society.
Maybe to comment again on Pauline here on the behavioral intervention and how long does it take to really foster behavior change in the real life setting. There's different research that is going on actually that proves that behavior change happens right after the game is played, right? Because right after the game is played, it's very still on top of mind from the people that are making decisions. They remember the game, they talk about the game in the communities, which is all fostering change of behaviors and habits in some settings. However, what's also shown is that this effect is not long lasting. So it's true that the behavior intervention needs to happen again. So eventually they need to play the game again to feel reminded of the values of the games that it induces behavior change in a certain setting. So therefore, it's super difficult to say if you want to sustain the change in terms of behavior, what's the frequency that one could imagine needs to come in terms of the intervention of the game every time. Also to mention, there's one really interesting example from Playing for the Planet. So what they have done in terms of inducing behavior change in games for pro-environmental behaviors is that they had used icons to, for example, instead of collecting coins, they have been collecting bananas. And that should enhance the environmental perception of the participants playing the game. And here it's a game for entertainment, not for education. So it has a completely different perspective of why you would play the game. And this is sort of a behavior change intervention that is a bit more subtle because you collect, instead of collecting points, you collect bananas in this game. Would this also translate to you collecting banana peels off the street in a real life setting or collecting trash for that matter, right? And this is still what is currently being experimented with. So there's not a lot of research in terms of how either games and entertainment to change behavior or games as an educative intervention to change behavior is actually impacting in the long run. There's also only studies showing that the games have an impact in a short time frame. So to add on Pauline's answer. Thanks, Zina, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Thanks, Pauline. I think it's extremely important to ask these questions, especially since we're working within the development context and impact is something that we are looking for. Again, I'd like to open up the floor to one audience question before moving on. So if you could just raise your hand. Pauline, do you mind checking who's raised their hand, please?
I think she hasn't. She's given Vahaila Kwaga.
Hello, I don't know if you can hear me.
There we go.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. So I'm a he, not a she. And thank you so much for this event. I've learned a lot so far. I'd just like to ask two questions. One, I think I heard Julia mention that there are several games that can measure trust, cooperation, and risk. Are there games that can measure accountability? For those of us that are interested in understanding accountability relationships, whether they be in formal or informal settings. And then secondly, I don't know whether I'm allowed to ask this question, but what is the recommended knowledge of statistical methods you would suggest for someone interested in using games to carry out social science research? Thank you.
Jennifer, maybe you can also support me on this question that, sorry, I can't see your name, has raised. I think in terms of testing accountability in a lab setting or with a lab game, the prisoner dilemma could maybe to some extent test accountability. As far as I could see, the game can, for example, be modified in a way that you put whatever accountability measure you're wanting to take as the center, and then both are kind of playing against each other to test the accountability, but it needs to be very specific. So I don't know if this is possible, but I would maybe point you in that direction. And in terms of social science research and background for the analysis of the data, I think this is doable if you have a social science degree or background. I think you can analyze it easily with SPSS, and normally from the lab games that we have run, there's also the possibility of getting the data in an Excel file, and then you can even just do descriptive statistics super easily on top of your head. It's not rocket science at all. I hope this is reducing your risk of your risk perception of doing it or not doing it. But Jennifer, maybe you can also come in on the accountability.
Yeah, so thanks, Julia. So I'm just trying to think about in terms of like accountability, and also like if I measure like trying to think about people's levels of honesty, think about like how are you able to measure honesty? I don't know if honesty and accountability will stuff like stuff like have a certain level, given level of like relationship. Yeah, so think about that, like we have different tasks that can help us measure like the most common one that we use, we call it the point flip task. So just being able to measure how much people are reporting, either maybe receiving heads or tails in a given task. Yeah, so yeah, but we can still follow up also maybe with just additional maybe pointers towards that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. So moving on to our third discussion point. Apart from understanding game elements, we wanted to understand what are the challenges in designing and testing games in the lab and implementing and then contextualizing them in real life. Do you foresee any challenges when it comes to technology, or do you see that there are different gamification techniques that are more impactful and effective when it comes to the lab rather than in real life?
Yeah, so I can take that question. So I think firstly, Jennifer and Julia covered the biggest challenge, which is that the lab setting is a controlled environment. The settings that we kind of recreate are very controlled, and the variables such as distractions, emotional states are all very difficult to replicate. So I think that's the first challenge that we try to overcome. And then the second challenge is behavior. So usually when people come into a lab, they kind of have the expectation that they're going to do a task. And then there's also the bias that they want to do the task the best that they can. And that makes it difficult to also translate into the field, which also is contributed to by monetary gains. So when you come into the lab, you're provided a monetary kind of gain, and that incentivizes people to kind of play the game, play it well, be focused on it. And then sometimes when you move that into the field, we don't see those results at all. For example, we were running an SMS kind of game that can work in a lab and it'll work really well. But then we realized that individuals, when they were doing it in real life, for example, they came into the lab and they said that the best time to receive a text to kind of incentivize them or like a reminder to incentivize them was the morning. And then when we move that to the field, turns out that the morning is when they have the busiest routine. So it was really difficult to replicate results and contextualize it. And that's kind of what Julia kind of touched upon as well, is how do you kind of take into the factor their life, their social interactions? How do you bring all of that into the lab? And it's really, really difficult. So some of the things that we first do are pilot testing, where we kind of create the lab game, we get the results, and then we test it out with a small group of people in the lab. Or another thing that we do with certain organizations is have a small rollout. So we have a lab game, we test it in the lab, we roll it out in a small fraction in real life, and then we kind of see what areas are like we are identifying, what the gaps exist, and then we bring it back to the lab and kind of test it. And that like iterative process makes it that we can kind of contextualize it to real life as well. So yeah, I think those are like the main challenges that when it comes to designing and testing games in the lab. To your question about technology and what kind of technology areas exist. So a big area that's been growing in Africa is telematics. And for example, there's a company in South Africa who's using telematics to gamify the concept of car insurance. So what they do is based on how well you brake or if you're staying within the speeding limits, all of those are tracked with telematics, and then you gain points, and then you're in a leaderboard, and all of that kind of equates to better premiums on your insurance. And it's really important because so many individuals all around Africa saw South Africa kind of have success with that concept, and they took it and they were implementing it all around, and it failed everywhere else. And it's because people kind of take it, even within the African context, take it that it's really easy to implement and contextualize things to real life. But you kind of have to understand that even within Africa, all of us are different people, and we kind of need to do the research, understand our audience, and implement it accordingly.
I think that's really fascinating. I was just wondering, Jennifer, if you had anything else to add with your experience with the lab in the field.
Yeah, so just to add on to that, thank you, Taza. Yeah, in terms of like some of the main challenges that I would say, like, with the games, it has to do with the low comprehension. So I think that's something that really, struggle a lot with, like, with our participant pool. Yeah, so some of these games, yes, some of them are easy to understand, but some of them are really complex in the way that being able to understand certain concepts. For example, thinking about a concept like probability, or maybe thinking about chance and being able to explain that to the participants. So it becomes a bit of a challenge. So it means also, as we employ certain measures to try and sort of like overcome low comprehension. So it means that for most of our lab studies, we have to sort of like read out the instructions and take participants through the process of being able to understand the games, because as we all understand, like for a game to be fair, like everyone must must have a level playing field. So you make sure that everyone understands the rules so that they're able to make decisions. So we have to issue out instructions, allow them to ask questions. Yeah, then additionally also we try to use there's a way we try to program our experiments that give them an interface that they can easily relate with, and also that also boils down to us being able to use, in terms of technology, we use computers that touch screen. It's easier for them to navigate. Yeah, so just trying to overcome some of the challenges that it results as a maybe because of the participant pool that we are using. Yeah, so and I think yeah, as much as lab games are interesting, but also just being able to work through the infrastructure and all that. Like we are talking about here in Kenya, which is part of like the developing world context. Even though Busara, we also work in other contexts, maybe the global south and beyond. Yeah, so being able to think about like how best we are able to adapt this from one context to the other.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think that's it's really important to consider all of these challenges when we are looking at implementing gamification into real life contexts. I think keeping this discussion in mind, something that is also coming to forth is ethical considerations. Now, these are extremely crucial, especially because we're dealing with data, we're dealing with participants, and we're dealing with having people maybe not quite understand when it comes, like what games are and what research is and how they come together. So I wanted to ask, like, how is this integration done? Like, how do practitioners from different sectors start integrating games and gamification techniques in their own practices, in their own projects, when they are looking to address like ethical issues at the same time?
Yeah.
So, sorry, Pauline, feel free. Sorry, you can go ahead, Pauline.
Thank you so much. So I think that line of done a lot about ethical like considerations, and the things that you need to think about, regardless of the sector or the field that you're working in, is the first thing is the consent. So consent is very key in any kind of research that you're doing, and it needs to detail like everything that is supposed to happen for a particular study. So from the goal of the research, like how the data will be collected, how it's gonna be stored, and who's gonna be involved in like using this data. So that is a key aspect in that. So another area is on transparency. So you're supposed to be very clear like on why exactly you're doing the particular kind of research, and what is the end goal of that research. So that transparency is key. And yeah, another thing that is very important is on data. We do research, we do collect data. At times you may be required maybe to collect personal identifiable information. So this is maybe regarding whether when you're doing a research and you need to install an app maybe on participants' phone. So you need to also be very clear on this. And then you also need to like store this data in a very like the best way that it could. So de-identifying the PII, personal identifiable information, is key, just to protect like the identity of our participants. Yeah, so basically I would say that's it. Murtaza, feel free to pick it up.
Thank you. I think you covered all the main points that we kind of look for in ethical considerations. I guess one point that I would like to expand upon is the data point. So I think recently, the more companies we talk to, the more data is becoming like essential, and the more the urge to get back as much data as possible is growing. So a lot of people try to use gamification to kind of incentivize farmers or anyone in at-risk communities to give more and more information to them. And I think that's where Pauline's point kind of comes into a real life context, is kind of being transparent about what you're doing, what this information is being collected, and also kind of maintaining the anonymity of the users as well. And something that a lot of people also do in an attempt to make sure they get the most information back from individuals is kind of promise that this game or this application has benefits that it doesn't have, or can help in ways that it doesn't have. And that misinformation sometimes is really unethical, but the drive to get data, the drive to get information and kind of improve their product is so strong that these are the routes that some companies are taking, and those are the kind of the ethical boundaries that we shouldn't cross.
Yeah, thanks, Murtaza. I've just thought about another ethical consideration is when you're trying to design these different games. So there are other studies that have very complex designs, but now you need to try and balance the complexity and simplicity of the game. So we do a lot of pilots to ensure that we don't give any like side an advantage, whether it is very complex, and maybe because we work with totally different groups of participants, those that are literate and those that are not. So you need to try to find a balance and ensure that each and every person is understanding very well like the different games, and the comprehension is good for each and every participant. Yeah, so another area that I've thought about is like regarding withdrawal. This is key like to any kind of research that we do. Like participants are allowed to withdraw from the study at any point. Like we do a lot of lab games, and at times they are paired and they need to make decisions as a pair or as a group. And in this case, when someone like doesn't want to continue, it's usually very okay to withdraw. And now you need to figure out like how do you go about this session to ensure that it goes up to the end. So in this case, you can try and maybe identify like someone who can sit in this case, but that means that the data for this group or this pair of participant is going to be discarded. Yeah. Thank you. That's it.
Yeah. Thanks, Pauline. Thanks, Murtaza. I think these are really important conversations to be having, especially when we're dealing with large data sets with vulnerable populations. I'd now like to open it up to question and answers. We have 10 minutes left. I see that there are a lot of questions in the Q&A chat already. So I'm wondering if we can answer some of these live. Julia, I see that you would like to answer one of the questions on what are the features of gamification in the example you shared, and how is framing effect in communication used for gamification? Maybe we can start with that, and then we can open up the floor to other questions.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sina. Yeah, the way we've done, we have tried to test the framing effect in the experiment that I was referencing in the lab setting, was that we had created two groups in the same room. So through the mobile lab that Jennifer introduced, we had one group that received the standard weather information forecast, the one that they usually always receive, right? And then we had a different group, that was a treatment group, that received differently framed information, the same information, but with an emotional framing. So instead of the standardized scientific weather forecast, we had an extension officer delivering the message, an extension officer that they knew. So there was a social influence, a social component that they were aware of where this information is coming from, and a person that they trusted, because the extension officer is normally delivering a lot of information that's relevant to the farmers in that area. And then what we also combined in that emotional frame message was an intervention on how we delivered this information, right? It wasn't only scientific, but we also included, the aspect that I said on your kids might not be able to go to school if you don't pay attention to this information as like an emotional frame to make them pay more attention to the information that was following. So basically, after we had created the treatment group and the control group, we led them through the same decisions that they had to make on crop choices, on fertilizer use, and on, can't remember the last thing, but I can also put the link to the publication in the chat afterwards. And then we tested whether those information or the way they made the decisions was significantly different from each other. Whether one group paid more attention to the weather forecast and understood it better than the other. And we also asked them a question on confidence. Are you confident this information you received is well understood in your community and your context? And we could see that from question to question, from decision to decision, their confidence did increase on the emotionally framed message and did not increase so much on the standard scientific weather forecast. So that way, kind of coming back to where this research led to, the framing effect was proven in to some extent in this lab setting. I hope this answered your question. Thanks, Sina.
Thanks, Julia. Would someone like to ask another question? You can raise your hand. Yes, Digvijoy?
Hi, thanks, Zina. I was actually interested to know, so when one starts developing these games, does one start off from the scratch, or are there certain repositories from where one can derive certain frameworks to use in different contexts? And if there are such repositories, what are some of these sources?
Yeah,
Sorry,
so
was my
yeah, So I'll give maybe just refer to some of the games that you normally use here at Sarah. Yeah, even though the process sometimes you might rely on analytical teams to to think about certain how applications on how to develop games. But most of the time we rely on games that have sort of measures that have been created and developed over time. And these are measures that have been used and tested to sort of elicit certain behaviors or mechanisms. So in most of our studies, we rely on measures that are already available. Even though it's also possible to think about creating games from Then when it comes more of a public repository, I would say maybe we can follow up with that, but internally we have our own repository where we have all the types of games that also, and we classify them based on what kind of behaviors they tend to measure. So it can easily always use them in from one study to the other. But I think the bottom line is just being able to adapt them to fit a given, study design. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see we have another question on the use of digital games versus physical games. Do people assume they're under more scrutiny when using digital tools versus physical games? Would anyone like to answer that question?
Mutaz, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I feel like you're the expert from us that could maybe answer that.
Yeah, no, sorry. I was just actually going back to the question to like get a full framing of it. Regarding digital and physical games, it's very interesting because a lot of people do want non-tech kind of gamification concepts. So they want to understand if they don't want to create an app or they don't want to create a game, what other gamification concepts can exist. And an interesting study that we're doing is we have a game called Resilient Me. That's not developed by us, but by one of our partners in the project. And we're kind of using that gamification tool to kind of assess the impact of like insurance with different savings groups and kind of using it as a tool as well to kind of see if we can assess within their savings group what other areas exist for streamlining. So I honestly think that the physical gamification aspect is a very strong one because, and we get questions about it all the time, like what are the non-tech versions of it? Because it's easy to implement, it's a lot less costly, and yeah, there's more acceptance of it as well with like, because there are a lot of the times people will say that our audience doesn't really use phones that much, they can't install a game, so what other options exist? And yeah, physical gamification is also a very, very powerful tool.
Thanks, Martha. Yeah, I think that's something that becomes extremely important whenever we're working with in geographies where there's low internet availability as well, and literacy levels are also differing. So keeping those contexts in mind is it's good to like have alternatives to digital games. Would anyone else like to ask a question? We have 2 more minutes left.
I think I can see a question on my end. I'm not sure whether it has been answered, but I can read it as it is. Yeah, so it reads, how can you make these tests more robust? Can we include a small questionnaire based on the materials as per your parental engagement example on the game-based app, instead of look at digital clicks and some other open-ended things? Yeah, so how we, like someone could make this robust is like maybe after like a parent and a child have read maybe a particular book, you can add like questions that are related to that particular book. And then this question can also guide when you're doing analysis to get a better understanding on the intervention itself. And then there's another question, like how do you know the game features impacted behavior and not something else? In other words, how do you control for confounding variables? Yeah, so for such a study, it's very important to at least ensure maybe you do randomization, and this will ensure that maybe the effect is due to the intervention and not other factor. Also, like ensuring that you do maybe a baseline survey before. This will help you to get like data on the before intervention and also do like an endline after the intervention. And this will also help you do analysis and compare the results. Yeah.
Thank you, Pauline. Okay, so I just want to say thank you everyone for your questions. For those questions that we couldn't address, we'll definitely be following up by email. As we wrap up today's webinar, I also want to thank our panelists along with all of you for your active participation. And I hope you found this session enlightening and you also take away some elements of gamification which you will use in your work.